I'm really excited to cover Business Central and Power Automate approvals beyond the templates in this video. A little more specifically, we're going to take a look at the approval architecture. Exactly how does it work? We will also highlight some changes to the V3 tables, which are the connector tables for Power Automate and Business Central. And then we're also going to take a look at how to create a simple approval flow from scratch, so we can kind of take a look at how to apply what we're talking about. Let's go ahead and get started. There are a few different ways to create flows inside of Power Automate for Business Central. One of them, right, is to look at a template, and the other one is to create it from scratch. We're going to take a look at the template first to kind of appreciate how the workflow approval works, and then we'll go ahead and create a similar one from scratch. As you can see here, I've filtered my templates to just show the Business Central purchase document approvals. So here what we see the purchase order, we see invoice, we see item, vendor, and of course credit. So these are different ones that we've seen. The purchase invoice here, we'll take a look at this one because this is pretty common. What it's doing here is it's going ahead and it's connecting to Business Central, the approval app, and Microsoft Outlook. We'll go ahead and hit continue now that they've all connected. So what this does is this gives us a template. Many of you have probably used these before, right? So what we're doing here is it's composed of a couple different things. And what I would also like to say is while you've used them before, I'd like to challenge you to see if you actually know, what it is that you're using. So when we condense this very quickly, what we can see here, right, we have this kickoff. This is the when the approval is requested. And that kicks off what's called a webhook. And this webhook is associated with, if I go into a purchase invoice here, and you'll see this is a common thing in Business Central as well. So if I go to actions and I go to this request approval, this send approval request button here, right, we know that whenever we do that, it's tied to the status and it kicks off. Well, this is actually a webhook, and this is like the front end. And this kickoff here is the back end, right? So this is what started. This also locks the record to go ahead and go through the approval process. So once it starts there, this record here gets the information from the approval, and that's associated with this row ID, because when we look at this purchase document approval, one of the outputs that it gives us is a unique identifier for that specific document, and that's also known as the row ID. Then it's going to go through an approval section here, and then from there it goes into condition, right? And it's going to say approve. If I look at this, right, it says the response of this is approved. So in that situation, if it's true, one thing that we're going to take a look at, right, is we see this approve. This is an action here. It's tied to this specific, let me close this back up, it's tied to this right here, okay? Because this is a workflow that it only is associated with that. So what it does is this is going to unlock the record. This step here locked the record, and this one down here unlocks the record. On the other side, let's say that the response was actually reject, right? So if it's not approved, then it's going to be reject. And so what we have here is that we have the reject, right? We see workflow, action, response, reject. So this is actually going to keep it locked, right? So this is actually, for me, the basis of what I wanted to get started here and explain to you in this template. When you know the basis of this, how these three components work together, then you can actually create a flow that's not using the template, because sometimes there's going to be scenarios that are outside of that template. Maybe you want to include an additional loop. There's a bunch of different possibilities that you will come across, that you will want to use more than just the template. And so you need to know the crux here of how it works to be able to do that. So now that I'm done with that soapbox, what we're going to do is we're going to actually take a look at building one. We're not going to go off on a big adventure on them, but what I'm going to do is I'm going to just kind of again walk through and show you how to recreate this from scratch and show you that it's super easy and how to do it so that you too can get this going. So that being said, let's go over here. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to start by creating a flow. I'm going to create a automated flow. And okay, so what we're going to do here is I'm going to go in here to my premium. I'm going to type in, or I'm going to look for my Business Central ones. And I want my approvals, right? So I'm going to look at my triggers, and I see here, I see purchase document approval request flow. Okay. So I'm going to select my environment. So right, so this is that same first screen that we saw on the other one. I'm going to select my company name, and of course I'm going to use my World Max Cronus version. And for this header condition, I'm going to type in document name. I can use a whole bunch of different header or line conditions, but I'm going to keep it pretty simple for now. And I'm just going to keep invoice. Just to show you, right, there's some more line options in there. All right, go ahead and add our next step. So the next step that we're going to do, right, is that execute action. And this is where things are a little bit different when we're using these V3 templates compared to, or triggers and actions compared to what we're used to seeing in the template. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to do this get record V3, okay? And I'm going to still select my environment and my company name. That doesn't change. But what is different is this API category here, right? So when I click on this, we're going to see some different options. These first three are associated with some onboarding experiences that are working on being automated more. This V2 here, this is what is all of your APIs inside of Business Central. Customers, vendors, items, etc., right? So all those tables that are currently available, that's what is going to be on the V2 here. Additionally, inside Business Central, if you post a web service, right? If you go to web services and you post like a new OData feed, that will also be available on this V2 list. If you have a custom API, that will be available. That would be on this entire list here, right? So next to V2, right, that would be your custom API. So that's super exciting that you can work with those directly from this Business Central connector as well now. And then we'll also have these workflow endpoints. So this is what we're going to work with today. So this table name is associated with the API category, right? So the list of table names that I get are going to change depending on which API category I'm looking at. So with the workflow endpoints, when I come down here, these are the different approval workflows that are currently set up, right? So you have customers, you have batches, and you have batch lines, etc., etc. Right now, we're just going to go ahead and take a look at the purchase documents. And then for here, what I want to do is I want to go ahead and put the row ID. So that row ID is the information, right, that's associated with this purchase invoice. And it's going to be an alphanumeric sequence that will pass around that information. Okay. From here, what I'm going to do is I'm going to go ahead and I'm going to start my approval. Now, there's a whole bunch of different things that you can do for approvals, but that's not the point of this video, so we're going to keep it pretty basic. I will say that you have standard approve and reject or custom responses, and then you can choose to have one person approve it or multiple people approve it. For now, I'll go ahead and show you how to do the custom response and wait for one response. And all this is so instead of saying approve or reject, I can have yes, and I can have no as my responses in here. So for this title, I'm just going to say approval needed, invoice, and I'm going to put number here, right? So that'll say the invoice number for, then if I put the vendor name here, right, then that'll come up. So this is my dynamic content. what is dynamic content? It's just a really fancy way to say that you can use the fields that are associated for each invoice that you're looking at, and that the information that's available is what comes from the screen that we're used to, right? So phone number, contact number, all of these different fields. Can you break that out is really what that's saying, right? That means to parse it. So anyway, so that's just kind of explaining what that dynamic content is. So if you're wondering when people are saying, you know, where does all this come from and those different things, that's what's going on there. So, okay. For the email, if it's assigned to, we can do, you can hard code this in here. In one of my videos in the series, what I'm going to do is show you how to create a dynamic email. So maybe that email changes depending on some certain conditions. So we'll look at that later. We'll also look at this details or this items link where I will show you how to create a link that will pull up that specific record in Business Central. But for now, we're just going to say, maybe we'll call this the number. So that's the invoice number. We'll call this invoice number. And then we'll call this name. So it'll be the vendor name, and we'll call this amount, right? So then if I come in here, we'll add this dynamic content. And so what I'm doing, right, is I'm having this part say, hey, every time this invoice comes up, I want you to pull in this additional information. Where did this go? Page name, there we go. And then I can type in amount here. Perfect. Okay. So, wonderful. Now we're going to add our next step, and that's going to be a condition. And what we're going to say is what we want to do is we want to look at the outcome, right? Look at the start and wait for approval. These actions here are going to be associated with the actions that have been done previously. So what we'll do is we'll say that we're looking for the outcome. And so for if the outcome is yes, right, because that's what we chose, then I want you to come over here and I need you to execute an action, right? So we got to, if you approved it, then I need to unlock it is basically what it's coming to. So keep the production in there. And then I'm going to go ahead and change my company. Okay, so now I'm back to this API. I'm going to go back to my workflow endpoints. One thing that you'll see, right, is just like before, our only options are approve and reject. You see that since I already set the one workflow up here, then it changes again the actions I have available later on. So I'll go ahead and hit approve. But what that's going to do is it's going to shoot out this workflow step ID. So I'm going to just come in here. I'm going to pull this from my dynamic content, and that's coming from that first action that came in here, right? So this creates the workflow step ID. So what this says is, hey, go ahead and take that record that we looked at to begin with and approve it. On the other side, we have the rejection, right? So we'll go ahead and do execute action. Perfect. I'll come in here. Brilliant. We're going to take my API category and we'll do the endpoints. And then we'll go ahead and hit reject. Okay? And then again, we'll get the workflow step ID that comes in here. We'll go work. Perfect. Okay? Now, I don't know why it does this, but it's a little bit weird. You kind of come in here and you put in this additional condition. You just leave it empty. It does tend to error out if you don't put it in there. Again, not sure why, who cares, but you have to have this empty condition for this flow to work nice. So then I'm going to send an email. Where is it? So now I'm going to send an email. And this is cool. I can send this email back to the person that requested this. So if I do requested by user email, that'll be who requested it, right? So the subject, and I can say approved. And what's fun here too is that you can use the when and period button, hold those down at the same time, right? And get the emojis. And let's see here, I think maybe it's this one. I can't remember where these little icons are. So if I come in here, I can use an emoji, which is fun, and I can hit like the approved button, right? And then I can say that your invoice was approved. Again, and put this little emoji in there, and you kind of know that you're good to go, right? So you can do all kinds of information. You can use all kinds of dynamic content in here, but we'll just keep it basic for now. I just like the emojis, and I think that they're fun. So now we come back in here, right? And we do the same thing. So this is for my no side. So I'm going to add my condition, my empty condition, and then send an email. Again, type in here my dynamic content and do requested by. And for the subject, you can say rejected. Hit the X button, right? So your invoice. All right. Okay. So now that's really it, right? So that easily we went in here and we recreated that template. And again, the crux of it, this is our kickoff, this is our release, this is going to keep it, rejected and closed. And that's really all it comes down to. One thing though that I would say that makes this kind of nice that I've been doing recently is you can rename your records, right? So let's just say that this is, rename this to say purchase invoice details, right? So then that's the approval. And then here we can change this, the condition of this is approval outcome, right? So this gives us a little bit more information. When I change and come into here, I can have this execute action. What is that execute action really doing? That is the approval, right? So that's maybe a release record. And from here, we can change this as well and change that to reject record, right? So block record. And now when I look at some of this, right, it just makes a little bit more sense. Keeps things a little bit clearer. And also, let's see, I think we can rename this here. No, let me save this and come into here real quick. We'll rename this. So rename this and we'll call this BC approval. Probably should have called it a purchase invoice, but that's okay. All right. So we see here, right? So now it kind of makes sense to us, right? So now we see some things that we actually make sense to us instead of condition, get records, etc., right? So let's go ahead and test this now. If I go into my purchase request here, this is open, so I think I can actually hit a request here. So now it's pending approval. What that is it's going to go ahead and it's going to send me an email here in a second. Okay, now I can see my email. Come over here, I've got this in here, right? So this is the information that we put in here, the invoice number, all of that, which is perfect. We see that it says yes and no instead of approve and reject. Go ahead and hit yes and hit submit. And then in a second here, we're going to see a second email come back, right? Because that's what we told us to do in our flow. And I see that I'm approved, right? Don't you love that? That little green check mark, it's just kind of visually appealing, right? It's very easy. I can come in here. I can see that that's good to go. All right. When I'm in Business Central, I can see that the status is actually changed to release because that invoice has been approved. Let's take a look at our flow to kind of look at the history of what's been going on whenever it ran. What's nice is we can see the history here. So let's click into this. If I look at my kickoff, right, my approval, we're going to see a couple different things. So this is the input, and what's more important, the output here, right? So we see this workflow step ID. We use that later on. And then this is the row ID that I talked about that passes that information to this screen. So now if we look at this purchase invoice details, when I look at the outputs, look, I have all of this information. A little bit cleaner version is to look at my raw outputs here. And you can kind of just see all the different information. This is all the information that was on the invoice, right? That dynamic content that we talked about. Scrolling down here, all the way down, we're going to get into our approval, right? So this is just the approval section. There's some inputs and some outputs. And then from there, we have the approval outcome. So we see that it was true, right? That means that we approved it, which is accurate. Then we have the approval release record, right, where this approved it. And then in our condition, we can see that this was true. And again, that it just sends the email, right? So then that's how that worked all the way through. So it released our record and we were able to approve it. So that is how you are able to kind of recreate that template, but do it from scratch per se, right? Because there's a bunch of different steps and journeys that you may decide that you want to take in between here that aren't included in the template. Sometimes you can start with the template and just add those actions, but sometimes it doesn't work very well either. I've tried that and it's about 50-50 depending on the project. I think it's more important really to understand what you are doing as well sometimes. That way as you progress in your Business Central approval and Power Automate journey, you can become more of a master of your own destiny. Hope this was helpful for you. If you have any questions, feel free to connect with me on Twitter or leave a comment here on YouTube. Thank you. Chat with you soon.